This conference will now be recorded.
I would like to start the Building, Zoning, and Development meeting on January 12th, 2021 at 7:10 p.m. Present are committee members Limpert and Schuman, council members Jones, Broussard, Glassburn, Heeman, Kelly, the mayor, law director, HR director, and planning director. On the agenda are ordinances 2020-77, 2020-145, and 2021-2. So we'll start off with ordinance 2020-77, which is an ordinance amending section 1135.02 of the zoning code of the city of North Olmsted entitled accessory uses for the purpose of eliminating the 200-foot residential setback requirement for animal shelters used for chickens. And Mr. Schuman, did you want to start, or Ms. Lieber, who wants to?
I'd be happy to if I could. Just to remind everybody, because this goes back quite a few months since it was originally introduced, and for anybody that's new to the meeting, about 8 years ago, we after having nothing on the books in regard to farm animals on residential property, we finally passed some legislation to prohibit farm animals on any lot smaller than 3/4 of an acre. And the only exception was chickens, and we allowed up to 10 chickens on the property. Unfortunately, we never addressed chicken coops. So a couple of people have actually been cited for this, and I believe there are two individuals that have been cited, residents that have been cited for this, and their citations are on hold because we have been discussing this. Originally, and as the legislation reads today, I just offered to get rid of that 200-foot rule, but I assumed that it would go before planning and there would be some suggestions, and then it would go before council and there would be some suggestions. And at this time, Councilman Limpert, I'd like to go ahead and ask that we discuss amending this legislation. I have a list of amendments to it that I think cover many of the things that were discussed at the Planning Commission and then at our meetings, and then of course suggestions from the Building Commissioner and Director Lieber. So the amendment would be, the list would be as follows. I'd like to.
Mr. Schuman, would you want me to just share that for people to read along?
I didn't actually give. I didn't give anybody anything yet. Okay. I don't know what you have. You might have some suggestions from the director.
Okay, yeah, then go ahead. Thank you.
So this is what I came up with. What I'd like to do is make it a 45-foot rule from the nearest residence. I'd like to have a maximum height of 6 feet. The maximum square footage for the chicken coop to be no more than 50 square feet. The chickens must be contained. That would mean either a run or the property would have to be fenced in such a way that chickens couldn't escape the property. And then if the chicken coop is unused, it needs to be removed within 180 days. And I will leave it with you, Mr. Limpert.
Ms. Lieber, do you want to make any comments before I open it up to the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do think after the last meeting, I know the building official and I had talked about some potential recommendations, and we did see value in having a maximum size and height, so structures couldn't take over, a large portion of backyard, and would set a height limitation as well. And I just have a question for Mr. Schuman on his first amendment, the 45 feet you said to the nearest residence. You mean like adjacent on an adjacent property, or would that include the primary residence?
Oh, no, that would be the adjacent property. I think we discussed that pretty well at our meetings, that somebody wanted to have it right behind their house, they could.
Okay, so I just wanted to make that clarification.
Thank you.
But
I appreciate that.
no further comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So my question on that is, we don't have any limitations as it relates to other structures and how close? I know we have obviously the minimum requirements from lot lines and other residents. Is there anything in the code related to how close that structure can be to your own facility as it relates to other structures?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So this would basically be consistent with other structures as it relates to the distance from lot lines and where within the frame of the rear yard you could put it, correct?
My understanding is that the other requirements of that section remain, which still requires a minimum setback from the property line of 10 feet. So that those accessory structures would still follow that 10-foot setback rule from the property line, in addition to the 45 feet from a neighboring dwelling.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to open it up to Mr. Schuman, unless you have any comments from a committee perspective.
If I could, the 45 feet is not an arbitrary number. The Planning Commission recommended 25. Their recommendation was based on the fact that if at 25 feet, any lot, almost any lot in North Olmsted could have a chicken coop. At 45 feet, almost every lot could have one. There might be a few exceptions, a few neighborhoods that are too close for chicken coops. And that was something that Mr. Glassburn brought up. He at one of the meetings, he said that he wasn't sure that all neighborhoods should be allowed to have chicken coops. And if the houses are that close, maybe that's a legitimate way of looking at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schuman. Any questions from council or comments? Ms. Heeman.
To Mr. Schuman, if I may, Mr. Chair. Mr. Schuman, when you're suggesting that the coop be contained, are you also suggesting that it be covered on the top? Or that, because some of them are designed like that, right? That they're fully enclosed with screening, wiring, that kind of thing. Thank you.
You mean a roof? Is that what you're saying? Should they have a roof?
Well, a roof, but not necessarily like in the chicken coop roof, like if you've got the run is fenced in, for example, with open fencing, you can see through it, that kind of thing, that there is an open kind of roof on it. Yeah. So that nothing can come down into the chicken coop like hawks.
I would assume it wouldn't be a coop if it didn't have a roof, but I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, only because you likened it, for example, to like a dog run sort of thing, right? Like that there's a caging of sort that the chickens are contained.
Well, so it's my understanding, and I don't raise chickens. Again, maybe we could talk to Mr. Dorncott about this because he seemed to be an expert on it. The chicken coop would be a roofed structure, and then a run is actually called a chicken run. And that's usually an area that the chickens can leave the structure and run around in. So that's and a lot of times, if you pull these up online, you'll see some of them have runs built right underneath them. They don't need a lot of room.
No, my question is just simply, are they roaming the yard as open so long as it's a fenced property, and then hawks could come and scoop them up, or this is a contained, kind of a roof structure run? And I don't raise chickens either, so I'm sure I'm not just asking correctly.
I think the recommendation from the Planning Commission was that the chickens be contained, and I think that came up at.
Okay.
So I mean that could mean a lot of different things. If you chickens will come home to roost, right? So if you did have them run in the backyard, it'd be like a free range chicken, but you have to have your backyard contained then. Have to have the chickens contained within your backyard. That's the way that I would like this to read.
Yeah, a run by definition would have a roof over it. And if it doesn't, it's not really a run. At least for chickens anyway.
Thank you. So if I may continue, Mr. Lippert?
Yeah,
So-
go ahead, Ms. Newman. Yep.
Thank you. So are you suggesting then in the, statement of the chickens are contained, that they're contained either in their coop where they, obviously that's their habitat, that's where they live and sleep, and or then in a contained run? Is that what you're proposing, Mr. Schuman?
That's correct.
Can we add that, Director Lieber, or is that, I mean, I don't want confusion about that someone says, well, but I've got this 6-foot fence.
Council can amend this however they like. If I'm no chicken expert, so I don't know what the standard chicken protocols are to really competently answer that question.
I would
Yeah.
be happy if this would be palatable to everyone. So whatever we need to do here, I'm good with.
Yeah, Ms. Lieber, I think we do need a definition of chicken run as it relates to the section of the code of whether that's prescribing it to some standard definition as the resident mentioned, or our own definition of a coop. I think it needs something in there or of a run, I should say, something that defines what the run is defined as.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Mr. Schuman.
you've disappeared. The coops that I've seen that are for sale, most of them have either a run attached, so a screened area directly attached to the coop, the little house where they live in, or underneath it. That seemed to be a big way of doing it, and they really don't need a lot of room again. So maybe Mr. Dorncott can speak to that, our local expert.
No, I mean, like, I think it's been a few months since we've met last. The chicken coop and run that I have, can you guys hear me? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. It's all self-contained. The chicken coop and the run was sold in two parts, the way I bought it or where I bought it from, and they basically all just attach together. There's a door that I can get into the run with, for like cleaning out, some of the run in that, and filling their food or whatever. But and then the chicken coop has other doors that I can access to clean out in there as well. But all of it is self-contained. I would think that if you're using language like run, you could just put in there like not open air, like covered on all sides or whatever, end roof. I don't know. However the legalese would say. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's basically it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dorncott said it hopefully correctly. Yeah, so I just think, and I don't know what the definition should be. It sounds like people have the expectation that the run would be covered, but I think we also need to sort of define that that's the run is part of the coop structure. Then, otherwise, it could be implied that, well, my backyard's the run, unless that's what we're all comfortable with, that the run could be the whole backyard. So I think it just needs some definition on the run. Any other, Mrs. Lieber, go ahead.
I would like clarification. So it sounds like council is saying you would like the coop and the run to be enclosed or covered, but are you also saying that you don't want chickens to venture outside of the coop and run? You don't want chickens to be able to run around in the yard, or they can run around in the yard when we talk about being contained? Is it like, would a fenced yard be sufficient containment if there's also a fully enclosed coop. I just want to make sure if we're drafting this, we're meeting our minds here on this, so we understand you.
Ms. Heeman, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, my concern about them being open, right, and just roaming the natural, like fenced-in perimeter yard would be just, with hawks and those kinds of things. We don't have chickens, but living over here, by Springvale, I mean, we have hawks. They pluck ducks right out of the creek. So it can get kind of dicey as to what's dropped in the neighborhood that's no longer alive. From their perspective. And so I would not want children in a neighborhood or, all of a sudden to kind of run across that. So long as it seems like the containment is really conducive to the chickens, I think that might not be a problem then to require that they be fully contained at all times and not openly running, unless somebody has a different opinion. That's just my thought of why I'm asking the question about containment. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly.
So as far as the run goes, if you're not going to have free-range chickens in the yard and then come back to a coop, then possibly can just state that the run would have either a solid or mesh covering to it. So if you had the run simply with the chicken wire or hardware cloth or however you do it to keep the little predators away from your chickens, and to keep birds from coming in from the top, I'm sure that would then cover that if you're having the outdoor run coming from the solid coop itself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I guess I have one other question, Mr. Schuman or Ms. Lieber. Was there any discussion on what was the maximum parameters of the run would be? I know we talked about the structure. I assume the run wasn't part of the structure size.
I can't answer that.
Yeah.
But I assume any structure, if it's a structure, it would be part of the 50 square feet.
Yeah, Mr. Dorncott, were you, if I, not to put you on the spot, but is that typically expected that the run is part of the structure? And I don't know how you are with parameters here, whether that's.
I mean, 50. I don't know what you would want to make the 50-foot requirement as part of. I think I measured mine, and I think my chicken coop is probably coop itself. If I had to guess, it's probably like 10 to 15 square feet, and then with the run, it adds another 10 to 15, maybe 20 square feet. So it could fall within the 50-foot requirement there. I don't know as far as, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure what I think of it. I mean, but want to go
Oh, Mr. Garreau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sitting here and my neighbor has chickens, so I kind of have an idea of how this chicken thing works, although I don't have chickens. But in essence, between the run and the coop, what you're saying is, and I'm thinking through language that you might include, is that, something like all areas where chickens are harbored shall be fully contained on all sides, which would include the run and the coop. So you can't leave it open, because you're correct. My neighbor has had chickens disappear with hawks. So you're suggesting that it needs to be, if you're harboring a chicken or chickens on your property, they must be fully contained on all sides, whether it's a solid roof or on the coop, or a mesh roof or mesh opening for the run. I think, wouldn't that kind of discuss that notion, kind of solve that problem of, we just don't have them running around the yard, but it would also, I think, be openly broad enough to cover both the coop and the run. So something like all areas where chickens are harbored shall be fully contained on all sides. Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'm not trying to belabor this, but I'm trying to flesh out the definitions here. So there's a certain structure, and that has, the structure requirements, and there's a run. And then with the run, there's a couple options here. You either have it fully covered, it needs to be covered, or it just needs to be enclosed. And my only question is, when you say it needs to be enclosed, what size is that? And is that part of a 50 feet total part of the structure, or is that some broader size? But from a personal perspective, I don't think it should be where they're free range across the whole yard. There needs to be an enclosed position, and I'm just trying to put some parameters of how big that run can be, because I'm not sure if that's part of the 50 feet. And if it is, that's great. I just want to make sure that that's clearly defined of what does that run mean, and that's part of the structure, like Mr. Carra was mentioning. Mr. Schuman, go ahead.
The 50 square feet is a lot of area for chickens. You just heard Mr. Dorcott saying he had about 35 square feet of chicken area on the ground. I mean, it's a big area. They don't need a lot of space. I would really wonder, maybe Mr. Garreau could answer this. Could we even legislate if somebody were to let their chickens out supervised in their yard? Can we do anything? Can we actually legislate that?
Well, you could. I don't know if you want to. I mean, you're right. If we're gonna let chickens, my neighbor does not have his chickens at all times within a enclosed run or coop. There are times when you might see the chickens run around out in the grass, and then he shooshes them back into the contained area. So they're not running the neighborhood. They're not taking over the streets. They're in an area that is regulated. Because if you don't regulate your chickens, you're going to quickly not have chickens, either by them leaving or them being taken by persons or animals. So, I don't know. Is the 50-foot area enough to accommodate both the coop and the run to those chicken owners here in the room, in the forum? And maybe if we start with that idea that 50 feet is your maximum chicken space, and then we'll kind of craft language that will accommodate that concept. So is that a sufficient area for both the run and the coop for those chicken owners here in the online?
I think for me at this point, I think it's fine.
Well, we're still limiting the number of chickens, right? That hasn't changed.
We're at 10 chickens, and we're not changing that now. That's
right. 10 chickens, and you're talking about a 50 square foot area for 10 chickens. I mean, I don't think you're dealing with humane issues and things of that nature. I mean, you're adequate space.
Online, you can see you can have chickens in anywhere between square foot all the way up. So you can imagine, and it's just a matter of how tight you want to keep them. And then at a certain point, again, if they're running the yard, then they're free range. So it's there's all different definitions for this. There's all different ways to do it. Chickens in chicken farms don't get this kind of room. Mr. Dorncott's chickens are living really good, and your neighbors are living real good too. I've seen your neighbors set up. So
one could say those chickens, Paul, are living high on the hog.
It's exactly right.
Any other questions from council? Okay, Mr. Schuman, my recommendation is from what you were proposing and Ms. Lieber's comments, Mrs. Lieber. I would just think that we need to, I would recommend that we make the whole structure 50 feet then, so it's clear that it's the structure and run, add run to that section on the requirement.
I'm comfortable with that. That's fine.
Okay. Just to get a gauge from council, any other strong concerns before moving forward with such a proposed amendment? Ms. Heeman, go ahead.
Thank you. I wouldn't necessarily qualify this as a strong concern. But my question, and probably because I just haven't read it thoroughly for a little while, what are the building materials, and are we requiring for example, Mr. Dorncott has this really nice prefab, kind of thing that he bought, and it sounds very attractive, right? Somebody else might want to just throw a little shack together and, just get some chicken wire and call it this coop. Are we regulating at all the building materials and process, and or saying that they should buy a prefab? If somebody could tell me that, because of course we would want them to be, attractive if the neighbor has to sort of probably see, well, maybe they won't see it if it's a fenced in yard, but again, I'm just questioning that part of it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I can speak to that a bit. There's no construction standard that I'm aware of in terms of zoning requirements. We don't have any in the residential district. We don't have any requirements for sheds or garages or other types of accessory structures. The only regulation would be under the Residential Code of Ohio, and to the extent they regulate chicken coops, I don't know, but probably our building official could answer that question.
Accessory structures under 200 square feet and under are not regulated by the Residential Code of Ohio. The only regulation that would really apply would be the exterior property maintenance, which requires you to maintain materials, etc. And that's no different than we have for any other accessory structure, such as a gazebo or a storage shed or whatever the case may be. There aren't any other specific standards for those other than the exterior property maintenance. I don't know that, from my experience in the past few years, that it's been a lot of an issue. We don't have people constructing their sheds out of bubble gum and so forth. So usually constructed in some other manner. So there's really nothing. It would not be unusual as an accessory structure is really governed by the same regulations that you would for a storage building or anything else. It's the exterior property maintenance code maintaining proper materials under that exterior property maintenance code.
Thank you, Mr. Gusmeyer. And
You paused yourself.
I was just giving everybody accolades for good questions. I think maybe we should put something in there. At least my recommendation would be to mention something that materials should align with our outdoor structures code, and therefore, while we're not defining it now, in the future, if there are changes to that or things of that nature, then this would align to that same language. Thoughts on that, Mr. Gusmeyer?
Well, I don't know that you need to specifically place it within this ordinance, since it would apply. The exterior property maintenance ordinance would apply regardless. So
Okay.
I don't know that would be a requirement of this ordinance.
I guess my only thing is, if someone's looking to build a chicken coop, they're looking in this section of the code to see what they can do. And I'm just trying to see where it's basically saying that this is considered an outdoor structure in this part of the code, right? So I'm just looking for definitions that if a resident's looking to add a chicken coop, they come to this part of the code, they know, okay, not only what are the parameters, but also that this aligns with, or this is considered an outdoor structure and aligned with the code. And that way, that's all I'm looking for. And I don't think it needs to be defined in this section, but it should be referenced to that proper, or reference that it's aligned with the property maintenance, something there. Otherwise, I don't think a resident would know that they would need to review that part. Does that make sense, Mr. Schuman, Mr. Gusmeyer, and Kim? Or, I mean, is that
I don't have a problem with that. I wouldn't want to confuse things, but I don't have a problem with it.
Well, I would also look for anything on Kim's opinion, but it's listed under these are listed under accessory structures, so we don't have anything specific for any other accessory structure. Since the exterior property maintenance code does apply to all of them, and it is
Okay.
listed to the exterior property maintenance structures. So.
Okay, that's true. It is a subset of that. Okay. All right. There's a lot. Ms. Seaman, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Lippert, I guess I'm confused, Mr. Grusenmeyer. If there's no requirement for a building this small, then how do you invoke a code from another section? And in fact, I happen to know that one of my residents ended up in, court over, it was probably because of the size of the structure, but so if there's no structure in Ohio Building Code, you said that is regulated as this small of a structure. Was that your first part of the statement? Maybe I didn't understand. Could you help us through that again, please?
Certainly, yes. Dwellings and their accessory structures, those structures such as garages, storage sheds, etc., that are in the yard are governed by the Residential Code of Ohio. But accessory structures are only governed if they are larger than 200 square feet by the building code itself. So anything under 200 square feet, if you're looking for how we maintain the quality of the materials, basically there are requirements under the exterior property maintenance code to maintain those, have proper materials and basically maintain those materials for anything under 200 square feet. And that would apply to any accessory structure regardless of size. And I think this is just listed under the other accessory structures. It's just another accessory structure. So it's currently not handled. If you added it and did not include any construction requirements, it's really not handled any differently than any other accessory structure it currently is within the zoning ordinance.
Ms. Heeman?
Thank you, Mr. Grusenmeyer. Director Lieber, do you think that it's at least worth adding a cross-reference to that section? Because these folks just probably want this small accessory structure. And they're, again, like Mr. Limpert said, kind of, we don't want to get them all tripped up with then how to get it, what to do. And so maybe, just a cross-reference to say that for, the structure, please refer to whatever that code section is or guide them somehow to that. Is that possible? So that they're not all caught up in the process.
And Ms. Lieber,
to sort of streamline it.
And Ms. Lieber, I think the question would be is that mentioned at the top of just the accessory structures section? Because it sounds like it pertains to all accessory structures that it's guided by the property.
Mr. Chair, there's no reference, I believe, anywhere in the residential district in 1135 that references the exterior property maintenance code. It's a separate code that applies to all structures in the city. So to mention it in one spot specifically, potentially could create confusion because why haven't you mentioned it in regards to other structures? However, for uses that do have other code sections that come into play, like noise ordinance or nuisance, or the fact that the actual permission of having chickens is included in the general offenses chapter, we can probably make a broad statement that, subject to other, so as much as I don't like calling out one thing, because then it leads you to ask, well, what does that mean? Gazebos are not subject to? Does that mean garages are not subject to? But I think chickens are kind of an interesting cross code issue that putting in some cross references probably it's probably not too harmful there.
Well, and I guess, Ms. Lieber, my point would be just put it in the accessory structure section, because if it applies to all accessory structures, and the only reason I say that is because other parts are like much more strictly guided by code, whereas this isn't, from what Mr. Gusmeyer is saying. So somehow people should know more clearly where they have to look to see what their expectations of this thing that they just built and how that's supposed to be maintained. It's just as part of this section as my thought. So whether it's just specific to chicken coops or all accessory structures, that's my only comment. So I guess I would leave that to you of what you think makes more sense in regards to that, but I would be open to that just being the whole accessory structures, given that these aren't guided as clearly by state code.
And Mr. Chair, also to point out that also dwellings, pavement, other things that aren't in that section. Well, pavement is, but dwellings themselves are also subject to. So I would think between this ordinance and the other one we're going to talk about, if council would like some kind of language that references exterior property maintenance, I'm sure we could find a place to put it in 1135 where it seems to cover and make sense.
Okay. Mr. Schuman, my thought is to, I think we're pretty close here to potentially hold this in committee and get kind of the cleaned up language. And I don't think we need a long turnaround time here.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's totally appropriate. I'd like to have the chairwoman involved with this too. She had some concerns about the welfare of the chickens, which I don't know how much we can do about that, but it's that might be another section. But no, I have no problem with that, as long as we aren't going to go after the people that have been cited until this is all over. So,
yeah, Mr. Garreau or Mr. Mayor, any issues with that? We're still on a good timeline. Okay. All right. At this time, I'd like a motion to hold ordinance. Let me pull up my agenda again. 2020-77 in committee and ask for a second.
second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes 2-0. Next on the agenda was 2020-145, which is an ordinance providing for the amendment of Chapter 1135, two-family resident districts to the codified ordinances of the City of North Olmsted. Mrs. Lieber, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I briefly mentioned in the public hearing, this is kind of an assortment of different code issues that have come up over time, mostly as we have worked with residents on some of their home improvement projects or maintenance projects, or things that have come up through the law department during enforcement, or just over-the-counter discussions with folks in the community, things that come before the BZBA. So it's a little bit of a grab bag, and I will be happy to kind of march through the different sections that are being updated. To start, we are proposing to update 1135-02A, the home occupation section, to align the signage requirements with the newly adopted 1163. So the code currently references like a type of sign plaque that's not actually in our current sign code. So this just helps to tie those to the new code section and more appropriately. In 1135-02C, that is a section on storage buildings and accessory structures. We are proposing an amendment that will distinguish between decks and patios that are covered, uncovered, or at grade. And this is really for the purpose of applying required setbacks. So the BZBA frequently receives and approves variance requests for patio encroachments. They do recognize like not every deck or patio is created equal. You could have a structure that is substantial in size, that has sides or an overhang or a cover or an awning, and that might have a substantial impact on the property, all the way down to a poured piece of concrete in the backyard where somebody has some temporary furniture. And so treating those the same under our code creates a lot of variance requests that are routinely granted. So we're proposing to take the one-size-fits-all approach to a three-tiered process. And so under this amendment, any covered or enclosed patio would meet the setback requirement of the principal structure. And that's how it's currently written. So anything that's substantial, covered or enclosed would continue to be required to meet the setback of the principal structure. So the two new ones would be that if your patio or deck is uncovered and unenclosed, that you can have that structure encroach into the required rear yard by 12 feet. And also we allow those around swimming pools. We allow that currently. So the rear yard setback requirement for any structure to a dwelling is 50 feet. So this would reduce that requirement to 38 feet. And then last but not least, the patios and at-grade slabs that are sometimes poured, we are now saying can really be anywhere on the property, but subject to the general setback requirements for accessory structures. So if somebody wanted to have a little seating area in their garden in the back, they could pour concrete pad as long as it was at grade because of the minimal impact to surrounding properties. So we think this will really kind of recognize the difference in impact and also help residents that want to make these backyard improvements be able to comply with code and not be in a position of requesting variances as frequently as we currently address them. Moving on to 113502H, rec vehicles. This amendment would better describe the activities during which RVs may be parked upon driveways. So currently we have timing requirements that are very specifically articulated. We have a requirement that an RV may be parked no more than 72 hours in a 21-day period. This issue was actually brought to us by the law department because they said that it is a difficult thing in terms of enforcement because you have to track, hours of the day and days of the week. And so, inspectors might go out and a vehicle, it requires tracking over the 72-hour period and the 21-day period. And I think it was described as like cat and mouse, like the RV might disappear. And then once the 21-day period expires, it'll come back. And it just took a lot of staff time, I guess, in some cases to determine if compliance, if the resident was complying with the requirements. So we had to ask ourselves, well, what are we trying to accomplish with this code section? And basically, we want people to be able to maintain their RVs. We want people to be able to pack them up and unpack from trips. So there might be a period of time where an RV can be kept in a driveway, but the specific time period seemed to be a difficult element to enforce. So we're proposing taking a qualitative more than a quantitative approach, which would allow RVs to be parked in driveways for the purpose of maintenance and for preparation for use. So not storage. So if there's a storage cover over an RV, that's clearly storage. And if it, if an inspector goes out and can see that it's being worked upon or it's being prepped for use, then that can be permitted. So if prep or maintenance takes longer than 72 hours, we're not having these. I don't know how often these issues come up, and Mr. Grusenmeyer might know better than I, but it was, we're trying to make this a little bit more resident friendly in terms of this particular provision in our code. Moving on, we are proposing to amend 113502K, which is prohibited accessory structures and uses, in order to clarify the language regarding the prohibition of carports. Currently, we have the modifiers portable and temporary used in terms of the types of prohibited accessory structures, but it left open the question to some residents as to whether any type of carport was permitted. So this amendment addresses that loophole and makes it clear that they're not. Moving on, section 113502L, we are adding a section called temporary ramps to allow relief for property owners seeking to install ramps for the purpose of accessibility and also establishing standards regarding their placement. So currently we handle these on a case-by-case basis, but we want to provide more clear guidance in the installation and use of these temporary structures as needed. So we think this is an important step, as people would like to age in place and stay in their home, but find they might have a mobility issue. This can help ease that transition. So those are the changes to the accessory use section. Moving on into 113505, the lot area coverage and width section. We're proposing to amend section 113505B, maximum lot coverage, to help clarify that all accessory structures contribute to the calculation of rear yard lot coverage. This is not a substantive change, but questions would come up as we discuss projects with residents, and we felt we could just enhance the language for better understanding in that area. And then the last sections that we are proposing an amendment, 113507, projections. And in subsection A, we would like to establish a maximum area of any entrance feature which would project into the front yard. So we're talking about porches and stoops and steps. So this amendment would limit the possibility of somebody installing a very large porch, which I think the intent is really to have an entrance stoop. It also clarifies a condition that we already allow, which is there are certain numbers of steps and sizes of porches and stoops require guards and handrails. But as you currently read the code, it could be misconstrued as not permitting that. So we want to clarify that those would be certainly permitted as they are required. And then the last amendment to section 113507C is to better define where air conditioning units and generators may be placed on a residential lot. Our code is currently silent on the placement of these units, but our practice has been that we require them to meet the same setback as the principal dwelling. We also have our noise ordinance, which restricts sound levels at neighboring property lines. We do receive a number of variance requests each year for new air conditioning or generator installations adjacent to the dwelling where that house is already sitting at the minimum required setback. This amendment recognizes the difference between AC units and generators, and that we would allow for a limited encroachment of air conditioning units in the side and rear yard, and would restrict generators to the rear yard only because of the increased potential for sound impacts. As technology improves, air conditioning units have gotten much quieter and more efficient. Generators of the type we're seeing are of a size to power whole houses and can be quite noisy. So side yards can be disruptive to neighboring residents. And finally, throughout 1135, we are replacing the phrase street line with front lot line to improve the understanding of this term by residents and owners reading the code. So street line was sometimes mistaken for like the street center line or the curb line, where we think front lot line is more descriptive and will be more easily understood. So I apologize for the long and detailed explanation, but those are the changes we're proposing. And if council has questions on any of those areas, we're happy to dive in more detail.
Thank you, Mrs. Lieber. That was a good, thorough rundown. Appreciate that, of the different issues. If I'm understanding these correctly, there's really only one of these that's really providing a more of a limitation, and the other ones are actually kind of alleviating some of the, well, I guess the recreation vehicle is sort of a whole new definition, right? But the intent of most of these is to alleviate and permit what is, as you said, has already been, typically approved variances. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, this is more in line with the types of variance requests we're seeing. It's a little bit more liberal in some cases, or recognizing differences between similar types of things like the deck and the patio I mentioned, or the generator and the air conditioning unit. So trying to create more specific regulations for rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. But yes, I'd say for the most part, I'd characterize these as providing a little more flexibility to residents.
The one question I had was on generators. Is that defined of permanent generators, or, I mean, given like a storm incident or something like that, the requirement to have the generator be in the rear yard? I'm just wondering if there's any provisions around that, or what's kind of the intent around the generators?
The intent was for the permanent installation, not if somebody had a portable unit for use during an emergency. So if these are going to be, what this code is considering as the permanent installation of a ground-mounted generator outside of a home, not for something you might store in your basement and pull out during a storm. But Mr. Grusenmeyer is also our generator expert, and I know has addressed a couple of these. He might be able to talk to generators a little more specifically.
Thank you. Mr. Grusenmeyer, go ahead.
Yes, it's permanently installed generators. The I don't believe the zoning ordinance really addresses most temporary or a temporary condition like that, which would be just a plug-in piece of it. It generally doesn't address plug-in pieces of equipment. The closest thing we come to is regulating maybe the location of a licensed motor vehicle where it can be placed in a lot, but generally the zoning ordinance of the building code does not address the placement of a temporary item. So it's really the permanent generators.
Any questions from committee?
If I could just make a quick comment, I actually, I think this is really good. This is kind of what we've been working toward to make City Hall a little more user-friendly for the residents, and I applaud the effort here. Thank you.
Questions from council? Ms. Heeman.
So, my question, and I don't know if it's directed to Director Lieber or Mr. Grusenmeyer, but the question about a generator would be that, so, if the home was built that the air conditioning unit is already at the side of the property and not installed at the rear of the property, then also likely on the side would be the gas connector. And of course, most of those generators are hooked up, directly to a gas line. They're not all electric. And so is that, a variance required for that? How would a homeowner deal with that particular issue? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, a homeowner could request a variance. We had quite a conversation about the generator issue at the Planning Commission review stage, because I think there is some interest in allowing generators in the side yard, but we also have a noise ordinance, and our noise ordinance carries maximum decibel levels at the receiving property line. And so one exercise we did is, well, let's see what kind of generator applications we're getting and what kind of sound output they create. And so typically we're seeing the whole house generators installed, the type on a permanent basis, and they really could not meet the noise requirements of our code if placed at less than, that minimum side yard setback. So it's possible that a resident could request a variance to install a generator in the side yard, but then they're also going to be confronted by our noise ordinance, which says that you can't exceed certain decibel requirements at the property line. So we thought it was important to align the zoning code with the noise ordinance and not say, well, you can encroach in a side yard in one code, and then in another code we're saying, yeah, but you can't exceed this noise requirement, even though that thing that we're allowing you to have is most certainly going to exceed that requirement. So we just thought by keeping them in the rear, we are creating less inconsistency between our different code provisions. But there certainly could be, in an exceptional circumstance or unique property configuration, a variance requested. And there's also, I think, ways of making connections from the side to the rear, running some conduit and pipe that could, where it could be located in a different manner that could comply to code too.
Thank you, Ms. Lieber. Ms. Heeman, you have a follow-up?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe then that those two seem conflicting, meaning the noise ordinance and then this, rear yard application. And that's because if your home is already constructed and your air conditioner sits at the side, you really probably conveniently for the homeowner want to put it there. So I would hope, Mr. Chair, that we could discuss an amendment that could solve that conflicting problem. Thank you. Specifically telling you that there's an entire development built that way in my ward. So a lot of homes that this can't work for. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Heeman. Any other questions from council? I think, well, before I go to the rest of council, Mr. Schuman, given that there was a lot of components in this, and while I think all of this is very positive, it's a lot to digest. I'm thinking maybe we should hold this in committee just to get any follow-on questions that can be addressed, and grouped together via email, and then hopefully move this forward. Do you have any other comment?
That's fine.
Yeah, but and Ms. Lieber, given that I'm looking at the amendment, and given the time of the year, I would think that most of these requests aren't coming in. This is typically a slow period for for most of the pieces of the code that this impacts?
Yes, residential stuff is pretty slow currently.
Okay.
So this could, yeah, a follow-up committee meeting would be just fine.
Yeah,
And if
so
there-
yeah, thank you. I will do that. And again, I thank you for the extensive summary of all the changes, because there was a lot here, but very excited about the direction this is going based on, hearing residents have to go through for variance processes of things, that ultimately got approved, and, having to apply for those variances costs money and delays, execution of some of these things. So with that, Mr. Schuman, I'm going to make a recommendation to hold Ordinance 2020-145 in committee. Ask that any other council members who have questions, please send those to the chair and myself, since the chair is unable to be present tonight. And then we'll schedule kind of a follow-up to hopefully button this up fairly quickly. Ask for a second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes 2-0. Last on the agenda is Ordinance 2021-2, which is a nuisance abatement, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Human Resources to request proposals from qualified individuals to provide nuisance abatement services for 2021, and further authorizing the mayor, subject to approval of the Board of Control, to enter an agreement with the individual selected in the RFP process and declaring emergency. Is this you, Ms. Lieber, or is this going to be Ms. Gallo, correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The legislation before you authorizes us to solicit RFPs for property maintenance nuisance abatement services. The responses are due February 19th, so I'm not asking for suspension on this.
Just a quick question, Ms. Gallo, have we changed vendors often in this, or what's been the history of, how often have we typically had vendors perform the duties, and has it been fairly consistent with a single choice, or has that changed over time?
No, it's been pretty consistent with one vendor.
Okay. And what's the typical, is it an annual contract typically, or?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions from committee? Any questions from council? Okay. At this time, I'd like to make a motion to approve 2021-2 and ask for a second.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes 2-0. And with nothing further on the agenda, I'll conclude the building zoning development meeting at 8:08 p.m.